Hello, everyone. This week's topic that you're going to be reading about, and I'm going to talk about just for a few minutes, is on multicultural and bilingual special education, the factors associated with that. And I think that I have a nice PowerPoint presentation for you that I got from YouTube actually. It's amazing what we can get now online that gives a lot of information about how we would understand, assess, intervene on behalf of students from different backgrounds. Whether they speak English but they come from a very different type of background, or if their language is different. So I hope that you'll pay close attention to a few things. And the first one is bias, our own cultural bias. One of the things that you're going to be seeing and reading about is something that we refer to as overrepresentation, or you might hear it called disproportionality. Basically, what they're talking about is we have far too many students who are black and brown in our special education programs, particularly males. I used to work in an alternative school, and we were sort of known as the dumping ground for the students that the schools didn't want to deal with anymore. It was in sort of a rural area. I was in the South. There was a lot of prejudice, and I believe close to 60% of our students were African American males. That's cray cray. That's not supposed to happen. That makes no sense. So it is really incumbent on us as special education teachers to do a couple of things. One is we want to make sure that we are using appropriate assessments that are as free of cultural bias as possible and give us the best picture of where our students are, and differentiating between lagging behind because of language or experiential elements that are missing for the student versus a cognitive or specific learning disability which affects the student obviously in a very different way. So being able to separate those out is really important. There are some things in the text. I just want to mention two or three things that I want you to pay attention to. First of all, the text talks about education and cultural diversity, and it says that we should be aware that there are many definitions of culture, but it is about values and typical behavior within the culture, language or dialects, the way it's used. A big one is nonverbal communication, right? So it's when we speak, when we don't speak, how we look. Um, so like in my family, I'm not, it's kind of silly, but in my family, I used to say that when I got this look from my mother, she'd do something with her eye like that. Never speak. It shouldn't have to. My parents had a lot of nonverbal communication strategies like that. So when a teacher looked at me like, something, I was like, whoop, I'm in trouble. A kid who never went through something like that may not even know how to read that. May even think it's funny. Look at the teacher, she's so funny. Then the teacher gets more angry because the student doesn't understand the intent of the look. This happens a lot. This is probably not the best example, but it is an example of how one's experience would affect their performance in the school. Also, awareness of one's own cultural identity. Um, Language is probably the most personal thing that we have, really. And what I mean by that is the only way you know who I am is basically what I tell you. I don't mean that you can't learn things about me or make assumptions about me based upon my actions and how you see me. But in general, the only way I can communicate the inside of me is through language. And so language is very personal. Countries, nations are very proud of their language. I was in Europe recently and talking to someone and saying how much people are speaking English all over the world. It's becoming the international language. Most places, especially young people, speak English. Sometimes I think better than people who English is their native language. Um, and in a conversation I had with someone older, he said, it's really a problem because we see our language leaving and we're very proud of our language. and it identifies us, et cetera, et cetera. But the younger generation, more and more, are just going to English. So language is about our cultural identity. It's what reflects about who we are. It's the sayings that we have. It's the kinds of topics that we joke about. All of those things define who we are. So the point that I'm making is that when we get involved in people's language, in the way they communicate, just be very, very sensitive, because oftentimes they are bringing a worldview, a perspective, a way of being able to think critically about things that may look very different than how we process the same information should it be presented to us. So it's a complicated process, and yet in some ways it's quite simple if you just keep your eyes open and look for how things are different, which is not bad, just different, and how that may affect learning and our teaching as well. Um, Another thing that I wanted to mention, I'm looking at the text, so just give me a second. Oh, the assessment pieces too. I've mentioned already about cultural bias. Just make sure that you pay attention to that section. So I'll just pick one thing out. Um, Curriculum based assessment, or curriculum based measurement, I'm sorry, CBM, talks about how we can basically use direct and frequent samples of performance from the curriculum on which the students have been instructed to then understand if they've gotten that material or not. If we're just giving a test, right? Um, and one of the questions is about the ice cream truck coming down the street. There may be kids who have no clue what an ice cream truck is. And so they're automatically, based upon maybe lack of experience, um, or it's something that just wasn't culturally, in their group. I mean, meaning in their culture, it wasn't there. They're already at a disadvantage. So one of the reasons you would just use something like a curriculum based measure is you're actually able to know that the student received this information, they received it in a non-biased manner, and if the student is able to retain that, to give the information back either in terms of a rote task like memory or an application task like writing, then you have a better sense of whether you're dealing with something that's more like a learning disability, or you're dealing with something that is just cultural bias, that basically the student is highly competent but is not able to demonstrate that yet based on where they are in terms of their own identity and their language abilities. And then last, there was one more thing I wanted to say to you from the text. Um, Give me a moment. Where is it? Oh, I mentioned at the beginning something about disproportionality, and I just wanted to make one other comment, and it's really kind of simple, but it's really important that in our everyday practices as teachers that we ensure that people do not mistake ethnicity for exceptionality, okay? Because when behaviors look different, when word usage is different, those kinds of things can come together for people to then make the assumption that something in the difference makes it wrong, or needs intervention and those types of things, and you know what I mean. Um, I don't know if this is a good example or not, but I one time got called in to talk to these or observe these two boys, and it was really odd. They were from Africa, which I know is not a country. They were from the continent somewhere. And I don't remember the country, but they literally got placed in this classroom. This was out in DC. It's very, very multicultural, very international. They got placed in the same classroom. They were both new to the country, and both of them were from the same country and just hit it off. Now, I don't know what it meant in their country to, when excited about something, to jump up and down. They would just sort of jump up and down and go woo woo. And they would give some way of jumping around with this kind of whooping sound. And they would do that together, and especially when something good happened, right? So, okay, to me, this is really simple. It's just like these guys jump up and down and whoop around. I got a referral to come look at their behavior because, it was so abnormal. So, here was my assessment. I said, "You guys are so funny." I said, I never saw anybody jump up and down like that before and then go, woo, woo. I go, "Do you do that where your country is, where you came from?" I would say they were probably 7. "Do you do that where you came from? Is that something?" And they're like, "Oh, yes." And they were telling me about some dance and something else. And immediately I said, "There's not a behavioral problem. They're just jumping up and down and going, woo, woo, woo," right? Okay, so let's just say jumping up and down is woo, 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 is like really weird to you, or think like that's kind of strange. Go look at it. Go look at a football game. Go look at all the people, painted faces and everything else going, woo, woo, woo. Same thing. We just have a cultural context for which we understand jumping up and down. And it just didn't look right in that classroom. So I got called in to look at the kids, and it took about 13 seconds. Anyway, you get the point. The point is that when we look at difference as if that means something's wrong, there's a problem, we're immediately going to move to a conclusion that a student is likely more disabled than they are, if they're disabled at all. But if they are, we're probably going to think they're more disabled and less competent and less able to come into a good relationship in the learning environment, as well as, again, to make sure our assessment is correct. The last thing I wanted to mention is one of the writing prompts is like, why do we pay attention to cross-cultural communication? It's very important to understand, and now this is important for the children too, but I'm going to use families as an example here. It's very important to understand how families and people from different cultures communicate, particularly in a setting like ours, because you and I may think, I'm just Mark, I'm just a teacher, kind of thing. But people coming in see us as professionals, as representatives of the school, and depending on where they come from, right, that says everything about the way that they're going to enact their communication with us. So, like, if we're so important and they're just nothing but lowly parents, they may be quiet. There's all kinds of ways to look at it. I was called into a meeting once because there was a very combative father, or at least I was told he was combative. Um, and you know what? Let me stop that. Let me say it another way. The mother had reported that the dad was really combative. I didn't know the mom, hadn't met the dad, but the family came from a very male dominant culture. And dad had been described as sort of erratic and whatever. So they wanted a social worker there. It was the funniest thing that happened. The dad said, "Where is the paper? Where is the paper? Like, I want this paper to sign." We didn't even start at the meeting. And he said, "In my country, it was something like this. I'm not kidding. It was something like there's God, or, Allah. You don't remember the term that was used, but there's like this higher power thing. Then there's the parent, and then there's the teacher," meaning that we were considered gifted in his culture. So he didn't even know why we had to talk about anything, because whatever we said was fine. Can you imagine? And everybody was all worked up. He was going to, be really demanding and all that in the meeting. But his cultural perspective of who we were in that meeting was quite different from what we assumed that it would be, based upon some of the things that we were told. That's just a simple example of where we want to pay attention to not having stereotypes or preconceived notions or making assumptions before family sits before us. One thing I want to mention before I close is low and high context cultures. For me, that's one of the best ways to look at cross-cultural communication. It's mentioned briefly in the text. It's mentioned, I believe, in another one of the articles. But I'll just tell you quickly my view of high and low context culture. In the US, we're in a low context culture. Context meaning those around us. Context meaning the way that we use what's around us in terms of our communication and the way we do business, okay? We're very low context because we are far more interested in debating, getting our point across, hiring the best expert. Because in our culture, in the American culture largely, our ways of getting communication going and our way of problem solving is oftentimes debating or having somebody come at the table and you throw something out, I throw something out, and then it comes all together. So you've been in these IEP meetings sometimes probably where everyone's like all at the same time. It's very American. In a collectivist, wait a minute, in a high context, okay, let me back up. Sometimes high context is called collectivist and low context is called individualistic. So you can see from what I just said, Americans are very individualistic. Okay, so we're out for number one. We want to be heard. Okay, in a collectivist culture or a high context culture, it's the group. It's how the group comes together. It's also about making certain that you have a place that is appropriate in which you're supposed to speak and then contribute. What many families describe who come from high context cultures or collectivist kinds of cultures, a lot of times what they describe is no one was ever quiet, so I couldn't speak. You would never talk over someone, especially if the teacher is held in really high esteem. You would never talk over them. So we get into this assumption set, right? They're sitting there quietly and going like this, and we say things like, well, they pretend to understand English, but they really don't. Or we say things like, I don't know what their level of education is, maybe that was the problem. They say things like, they seem like nice people, but I don't think they were very interested. The whole time the family was just waiting for us to give them a turn to talk because that's not how they process. They don't process through that kind of, rather combative style. So I would ask you to just look up high and low context culture, individualistic, collectivist culture. The concept is really important to think about. When you take SPED 505, which is a consultation class, you're going to learn more about this. So I could go into a lot of detail because I think it's very fascinating, but I'm not going to do that. But I would encourage you just to look up the concept of communicating across low and high context cultures, because you'll see a list of behaviors that are more evident, in our culture versus how it would be evidenced in other cultures that come from a different perspective, and in this case, the collectivist perspective. So anyway, I hope you enjoy the readings and the PowerPoint presentation. And please, again, think as you're doing the assignment, etc., that as a teacher, how would you become the best for students who have special learning needs because of their abilities and not disabilities, but the factors that play in that may or may not be the reason that we're seeing the kinds of actions that we're seeing or the results that we're seeing on tests and things like that. I think you get the point. I hope that I'll be reading some nice things that you have learned and will be taking on in your teaching practices in the future. Thanks.